Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Donner with the Shapiro Foundation here in Pittsburgh. Oh, hi, Jenny. Unlike other panels, so we're the Shapiro Foundation. We're a proud sponsor of the Eradicate Hate Global Summit. So in a kind of role as on the executive committee, I'm now introducing myself, right? There would normally be somebody at the podium. We have one member of our panel who will be here in a few minutes, but we're gonna get started, and we're still gonna end by 2 o'clock, so we don't make everybody late for the next session. This is panel 211, a funder's manual for the prevention space. So if that's not what you thought you were here for, feel free to move on, or that might sound even more exciting than the panel you had planned on. So like other sessions, there's the QR codes on the side. Feel free to submit any questions as we go. And we're not going to do formal introductions, but those of you watching on the live stream or in the room can look through the book to look at everybody's bios. We're coming down the home stretch of a tremendous conference, which the halls have been full of researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and advocates who have been bringing their knowledge to the table with all kinds of sessions covering what we know, what we don't yet know, strategies, interventions. This session is going to be coming from the perspective of philanthropy. What's our role in the philanthropy sector in preventing targeted violence? So in this session, we're going to, in the next 46 minutes and 38 seconds, we are going to cover goals and outcomes. What are we trying to accomplish? We're going to lay out a framework for taking this vast area and try and break it down into manageable chunks for grouping and evaluating programs and investments. We're going to talk a little bit about the real and perceived challenges of being a funder in the space. And like all sessions at the conference, we're going to end with clear recommendations for moving forward. So with that, the panel, everyone's going to take 1 or 2 minutes to just share a little bit about what they do and what their role, how what they do intersects with philanthropy. Brett, why don't you go first?
All right. Oh, and perfect timing, Rachel. So Brett Steele, I am the Senior Director of Preventing Targeted Violence at the McCain Institute. And we have taken on the project of we've had 8 different philanthropic organizations approach us over the last year saying they want to invest in this field, but they're looking for guidance on where to start. And so we have been trying to build resources for the philanthropic sector for how to invest in evidence-informed programs in this space.
Excellent. Hayne?
Hi, everyone. My name is Hayne Yoon, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the Justice Department's Office of Justice Programs, which many of you may not have heard of. But the Justice Department has 3 grant-making entities, and OJP, the Office of Justice Programs, where I work, is the largest of the 3 grant-making entities. So we have a slate of hate crimes programs that are targeted towards enforcement, prevention, and also services for victims.
Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, and I'm so sorry I was on the last panel that went a little bit late. I'm Rachel Brown. I am the founder and executive director of Over Zero. Our work focuses on preventing, reducing political violence with a focus on identity-based violence and other forms of group-targeted harm. And we have worked with different philanthropic leaders and philanthropies since 2017 to really try to build understanding and frameworks for whole of society approaches to address this issue set.
Great. Jenny, welcome.
I'm large on your big screens. It's really nice to be here. I'm here in Denver, but with you in spirit and on the screen. I am the co-director of a pooled donor fund called the Trusted Elections Fund that came together in 2019 to respond to election-related crises. And political violence has become a center priority for us because for all of you who know and watch political violence and targeted violence in your own fields, we are seeing it really front and center in our democracy. So it shows up differently in our democracy with threats to election officials and threats and intimidation to both grassroots organizing efforts, political campaign leaders, and everywhere else in between. Over the last several years, we've been working with a group of donors who are interested, similarly to Brett's point, of getting involved in this field. And we recently worked with the Democracy Funders Network on a donor guide highlighting some of the issues that we'll talk about today.
Excellent. So jumping right in, our foundation, like many, whenever we start in a new space or new project, we always ask ourselves, what are we trying to accomplish, right? Foundations are always focused on outcomes, and the better you can define what it is you're trying to accomplish, what those outcome measures are, the more deliberate and strategic you can be in the strategies and how you invest and how you organize. There was a fantastic panel, which Brett, you participated in earlier, all about taxonomy, which I highly recommend going back. In some ways, the sessions are two-parters, talking all about the importance of language and the nuance and the different audiences. So I encourage you, if you're interested in that side of articulating outcomes, to go back and watch that panel. But we're real briefly, for everybody on the panel, what advice do you have for funders who are in that early space, trying to think through what's the outcome that they're trying to accomplish in the space, either how to think about it or what measures? Why don't we start with you, Jenny?
I think the first thing that I would say is engage. That this is a complex issue, but I would say first and foremost, it's impacting every sector in our communities, whatever issue area they're working on. The heightened threat of violence and extremism is showing up throughout our field. So I just start by saying engage. For Trusted Elections Fund, we focus on preparedness. So even starting with education around the threats and the opportunities for interventions is a good place to start. There's a lot of education that can be done. And the last thing I'll just offer is to lean in with an equity lens and impacted communities. There's a lot to learn from people who've experienced violence. So starting with impacted communities is a safe place to go.
Great. Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say it's definitely not an easy issue, but it's kind of inescapable at this point. We're living in the world that we're living in, and I think we've seen over the past years, whether you care about democracy and elections, whether you care about public health, whatever the issue is, if political violence is allowed to grow, and if this type of the rhetoric, the organizing that accompanies it is not addressed, we really know where this path leads, and it undermines our ability to address any other issue. And so we're sort of forced to confront and engage with it. And the good news is it might seem messy and uncomfortable and hard to wrap your hands around from the outside and as a starting point, but there are a lot of organizations, there are funders that have been engaging and on their own learning journeys for years. So I do think starting and engaging, there's a lot of starting points there. And we do actually know a lot about what matters. So I know measurement is really tricky when it comes to violence because you're tracking prevention, right? So our ultimate goal is maybe that something doesn't happen, and it's very hard to know a counterfactual. But at the same time, we do know a lot. We know what our risk indicators are. I came from international work on election violence and genocide and atrocity prevention to the US in 2016 because we saw clear patterns of communication and rhetoric and knew what they lead to. So we can measure things like looking at the tone of public rhetoric. We can measure a lot of risk indicators and we can see how they're faring. And we also know what matters for resilience. We know that things like strong relationships across diverse sets of leaders that have high levels of trust in communities make them better able to respond to instances of violence, right? We know that's just one example. We know that that perceived social norms, what people think their peers or others are doing or approve of, really matters. We know all these sort of interim indicators that we can also measure and look at to see if we're building resilience and if we're making progress. The other thing I would say is the trend lines are not good on this issue set, right? It's getting worse, so we have to go in knowing that that if you think about early in COVID, right? Or even now, how we measure a public health success. It's not just that it goes all the way away, it's that something is spreading and we slow the spread or we stop the spread, we stop it from getting even worse than it is. And so this is one of those issues where if we do nothing, it will continue to get worse. We know that. We know what that looks like. And so we can look at what we might be preventing and really think about measurement within that context. And so I think it's in part about just really looking at the reality in front of us and finding those things that we can measure. And yeah, I would just say there's a lot that can be done, and there is a field that has been cohering more and more over years, and there's a real starting point to build on.
So the outcomes question is a little bit complicated on the government side. It's a whole other sort of set of factors. But at the Justice Department, on the one hand, we are responsible for tracking incidents of hate crimes and receive that information from both police departments through the NIBRS. Used to be the Uniform Crime Reporting System, but we've transitioned to the NIBRS system. And then there's a survey of crime victims called the National Crime Victims Survey, the NCVS for short, which is not necessarily reported crime to police departments, but crime that victims have experienced or survived. And so, as we've heard throughout this summit, obviously there's a lack of good data in terms of the true incidence of hate crimes, both crimes and bias-motivated incidents. And so we're trying to do our part within the different components of the Justice Department to improve reporting, but it's a very fraught issue, as we've talked about throughout, and part of it is the reluctance of some victims and survivors to come forward, and also different state laws and an ability to really categorize what someone experiences. We're hopeful that the new system will be much more improved in terms of being able to capture different kinds of crime, but there is a whole transition period where we're not sure what the numbers will look like. I'll just put it that way. And then on the outcome side, in terms of programs for law enforcement, prosecution, I think it's a little bit difficult in terms of we don't necessarily evaluate those programs right now in the traditional way that other programs are evaluated. However, Congress has asked us to report on a lot of data and information about these programs so they can track where our sort of public dollars are going and what law enforcement agencies are doing. And we have a new program called Community-Based Approaches to Preventing Hate Crimes, which Congress funded for the first time in this current fiscal year, which ends at the end of September. And that is, it's our first year. We're not ready to evaluate it yet, but eventually what we would like to do is to be able to evaluate different kinds of approaches to know what works and what doesn't.
I just want to amplify what Rachel was saying and build on it a little bit. There's a common red herring in this field of, well, you can't prove a negative, you can't prove a counterfactual, and therefore how can you know whether what you're doing is working? Ultimately, we are attempting to prevent acts of hate-filled violence, targeted violence, election violence, pick your form of violence. But we know that there are certain practices that can lead to that prevention. And so whether you're working to raise awareness, you can measure that increased awareness. If you're working to improve bystander reporting, you can measure willingness to report. If you're working to improve threat assessment and threat management, you can measure that reduction in risk factors or increase in protective factors at the individual level. And if you're working to reduce recidivism, or reoffending, you can measure that as well. So finding the element of prevention of this type of violence that works best with your mission and your risk tolerance, and then finding those metrics that align with that field.
Well, so what's amazing is, you could have different foundations and organizations that, one that wants to promote civil dialogue and another one that wants to prevent future acts of targeted violence, and government being focused on reducing incidents of hate crimes, right, in a geography. And they're all related, but they're all a little separate, and they're measured in different ways. And in an earlier session, somebody talked about how if you don't sometimes if you don't understand how things interact, it looks like it's just spaghetti against the wall, even though it's actually thoughtful and organized. So this is a great start in thinking through those issues. So moving from outcomes to interventions, Rachel, why don't you walk us through the framework that you put together and that Jenny used in her report that she did together with DFN.
Great. And we put this together, I'll say, with support from Jenny. So thank you.
With
3 large screens of Jenny that I see in front of me. I think we have a slide for this one, but what I'll share is we did a landscape mapping specifically on the election violence prevention space, looking at what are the different types of initiatives and strategies that groups are taking, sort of trying to take what looks like spaghetti against a wall and actually look at how it forms a set of interdependent, mutually reinforcing strategies, and how people that might not see themselves necessarily in this field are actually contributing to violence prevention. I think this is really important as political violence, as hate violence impacts across different sectors and fields more and more. We're getting requests from business leaders or faith leaders, people that don't consider themselves squarely in this field, but are having to find themselves dealing with it. And I'll give one more piece of context before we see the diagram, and then if we don't get it, I'll just
Could we have
talk.
the slide, please, with the circles? Thank you.
But what I'll say, I think something that's really important to this spaghetti on the wall point is that it's not just one strategy, tactic, or approach that takes us to a heightened risk of political violence and of hate-fueled violence. Right? We are seeing multiple different strategies and tactics used to influence the communication ecosystem, to influence our institutions, to activate and coordinate and organize armed groups, et cetera. So it's not going to be just one approach from philanthropy that will address it. We're going to need a constellation of different approaches that reach and engage different parts of our society. And I think the exciting thing about it is that means that there's a starting point, whatever you're already engaged with, there's something that there's a starting point that's going to be somewhat of a fit to engage. So what we saw when we did this landscape mapping of the field, we talked to more than 50 different organizations working in this space. We also spoke with different international experts whose work spans 120 countries globally to sort of take what we actually see already happening here with the unique dynamics of the US, map it onto what we know matters for these broader violence prevention initiatives internationally, and create what the ecosystem looks like here. So you see here a lot of interlacing bubbles. So the first, supporting and engaging government. These are initiatives, groups that are focused on our institutions and on looking at both protecting our institutions from being influenced by political violence and sort of maximizing engagement of government institutions and actors to use their roles to prevent violence. So this includes efforts to keep people safe, a lot focused on election administrators, but also other types of government officials who are facing threats, intimidation, and harassment. So there is a threat detection and response element here. There is an element of supporting government officials who are finding themselves on the front lines of these dynamics and having to address this on top of their usual workload. So making sure that they're actually able to complete their duties in whatever their role is as a mayor, as a secretary of state's office, et cetera, amidst these threats of political violence and the harassment that comes along with it, where they are the target. And then there are efforts to engage government to really use its platform for prevention, things like what ICAP and Mary McCord do to help government understand laws around militia group mobilization, initiatives that help government officials actually use their communication platform to shape norms, to educate the public, efforts that convene across government for scenario preparedness and building teams that can respond to hate and bias incidents or political violence. So this is really about protecting our institutions and actually using our institutional strength for a prevention tool. Next is this category of activating broad-based civil society. There is a permissive environment for political violence when the sort of narrative and perception of norms shifts, and we've seen this as a risk factor here, that the sort of the public narrative in support of political violence and the rhetoric that drives it. And so it's really important to have a really broad, diverse set of civil society that reaches across partisan lines, but also across sectors, that reaches faith leaders, business leaders, veterans communities, civic associations, and that really is able to activate people to set public norms and expectations against political violence and against hate-fueled violence. And so this work is really about activating across different segments of civil society to be able to take the action that they can take. And that varies, that's tailored, right? Business leaders might put out public statements, but also might make calls and convene people. Faith leaders might also put out public statements, but be able to counsel people in their community. So really activating this broadest possible, most diverse possible coalition that is standing up and setting positive norms. Then we have work that is really specifically targeted at extremism. Brett is going to talk lots more about this, so I'll just, as a framing, say that here in this category, we include initiatives that are directly reaching extremist groups, working on de-radicalization, preventing recruitment, creating off-ramps, but also containing the influence of extremism. So addressing its impact on institutions, especially people who are political leaders, political parties, and state security forces, law enforcement, military, et cetera, and also on supporting victims and containing the impact of extremism. Then we have efforts that are specifically focused on the communication ecosystem that is driving towards this type of violence. So large-scale defensive work, really, at interrupting sort of these online rabbit holes and the mis and disinformation and those narratives, proactive communication, engaging to set positive norms or change narratives or even work with narrative media, and efforts to engage platforms. And then really quickly, there is a specialized set of groups that are working directly on this. Probably Brett falls in this category, our work falls in this category, that are providing research, support and training, convening, and helping to make sure that this field is greater than the sum of its parts, working together. And it is all only possible if there is actual long-term funding that enables this type of infrastructure to not just be created, but to operate outside of boom and bust cycles, to be able to respond to risks, do rapid and crisis response, and also seize on moments of opportunity to really leverage them and move us in a positive direction.
Wow.
Sorry.
So, right, talk about starting to put some order around spaghetti on the wall, which I now realize is the metaphor of our panel. So let's take a little bit of time to dive into each one. And again, there have been so many sessions over the last 2.5 days that have gone into lots of detail on exactly what's happening in each of these areas. And we're going to focus a little bit on the role of philanthropy to fill in some gaps, activate, amplify what's happening in those spaces. So let's start in the top left with supporting and engaging government. Hayne, anything you want to add from your perspective to this idea of both supporting and protecting the instruments of government, but also the role of government in preventing the future acts of violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think for too long, we've really been focused on the enforcement side, which of course is incredibly important. And that has implications, I think, for prevention. But I think we're also now interested and being pushed by Congress to move into thinking more about preventing both hate crimes and other kinds of violence. And this is a space where I think we don't know what we don't know. And so I think we look to the field to bring us ideas. that we can fund. And so we certainly think that philanthropy can play a huge role in terms of seeding different ideas and sort of piloting different things, and that we can take a look at and with our sort of research and evaluation capabilities, really look at what is effective, but having some evidence from the field that indicates that a program is already working is hugely helpful for us. And so I think that philanthropy can play a really huge role in terms of being able to also have a lot more flexibility with its funding, which we don't. Almost all of our funding is prescribed by statute and by the congressional appropriations process. We actually have very little flexibility in terms of how we use our funding, and because philanthropy can sort of be more responsive in the moment and think about where to use its funding, thinking about novel approaches, sort of discovering all the great work that's being done out in the field and really bringing that to light, I think is really sort of complementary to our work.
And I just want to add, so many parallels to what you said on the prevention side. After the tragedy that happened in our community, the federal and state government were enormously helpful with resources and knowledge to help our community in those early days. I'm not going to try and remember all the acronyms for the different programs and organizations, but it was both enormously valuable. And as you said, there were opportunities, there were things government could do where philanthropy needed to step in where they couldn't, and in terms of organizing and helping to make sure that those government resources got to the right place. There was a strong network of NGOs and philanthropy behind that. So that's great. So moving on to civil society, Rachel, you talked a little bit about the importance of setting norms, behavioral norms, the role for philanthropy in that. Maybe say more.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly funding investments here. I would say most philanthropies are already deeply invested in some set of issues and groups that does have a role to play in using their voice on this. So there's an opportunity to invest further and engage in those places where there are already connections, knowledge, social capital. But I would add two other things. I think there's also an opportunity just because there's a lot of different violence-related spaces, especially now that it's permeating. So finding ways to connect across, I think philanthropy has a real bird's eye view. So finding ways where philanthropies, I think it's really effective when philanthropy can work together to have a landscape and an understanding of sort of who's funding what. Okay, you're funding in the faith space, we're in the veteran space, and start to make we're in the election violence prevention space, we're in the hate violence prevention space, starting to make some of those connections across the ecosystem and provide support that lets different civil society do that. But I also want to make the point that a really big thing that matters here when it comes to setting norms is really about whether or not people choose to use their own platform, their own influence, and their own social capital. And philanthropies themselves have a lot of it, right? So it's not just actually about funding. I think it's also about asking, where are our connections? Where do we have influence? Who are we as a voice? How are we engaging other funders and philanthropy to talk about how we might engage in this? So I would also encourage philanthropy to see itself not outside of this problem, but as another actor in the ecosystem, and to think about more resources than just grant money.
And when we were planning, Brett, you brought up the point about the significant overlap between activating civil society and the prevention space. So why don't you speak to that?
Right. Can we go to the next slide? There we go. So when it comes to preventing violent extremism, we really look at the bottom two circles in Rachel's diagram in the types of programs that can be relevant across the ecosystem of preventing hate-fueled violence, targeted violence. One thing I will say, in addition to what Rachel said about the role of philanthropy and civil society, is there's also an element of credibility. A lot of the funding historically for preventing hate-filled violence, at least in the last 5 years, has come from the federal government. And when it comes to activating broad-based civil society initiatives, sometimes philanthropic funded initiatives may have greater credibility because government funding can be politicized. And I say that as someone who worked for 9 years in government. But so recognizing the role of philanthropy in filling some of those gaps where government funding may not be as particularly well suited as it is for other elements of this map. When we look at activating civil society, which is really this primary prevention lane on the left, and then preventing and containing extremism, which are the secondary and tertiary prevention towards the center and right of this diagram. We're looking at youth resilience programs. What are we doing to bolster protective factors among youth, especially social cohesion and social connectedness? It reduces risk for just about every form of violence, which again, from a philanthropic perspective, the broader your impact across multiple forms of violence, the broader your return on investment. Second, media literacy and online critical thinking. This kind of turns into the information ecosystem, which is where we're going next, but recognizing the importance of integrative complexity, teaching critical thinking, and teaching youth in particular to be able to hold more than one concept at a time and get out of that black and white thinking. Raising societal awareness, that broader-based activation of civil society. When it comes to preventing and containing extremism, that far right circle on Rachel's diagram, looking at bystander training. How do we actually empower parents, concerned adults, teachers, coaches, anyone interacting with youth or adults who may be mobilizing to violence, may be considering that violence is justified? How do you help them understand what they're seeing and know where to go for help? And then next, referral services. How do we get them to the point where not only do they know where they're going, where they can go for help, but they're willing to do it? And it's a type of referral they feel safe using. We had a panel earlier today on intimate bystander reporting. Most people don't feel comfortable going to law enforcement in the first instance. They won't go to law enforcement until that last possible second when an attack is imminent. Can we get them to social service providers much earlier in that process so that we can get better outcomes for these youth? Threat assessment and threat management teams. What can we do to actually understand the risk that an individual poses, but also understand their biopsychosocial needs and their strengths, and reduce those risks over time and increase those protective factors over time so that they ultimately are no longer motivated to commit violence. And then finally, in this circle for preventing and containing extremism, what can we do for individuals who have committed acts of violence, have joined some of these hate-based movements, maybe coming out of incarceration? What can we do to help them get the support they need so that they're not motivated to reoffend? And so what we've been doing at the McCain Institute, we've taken the 9 systematic reviews that have been funded across the field by 5 different federal governments, and pulled out the evidence-based practices for each of these types of programming to give the philanthropic sector guidance on here's how to know whether programs in each of these areas are actually evidence-informed.
Great. And so I just want to underline 2 points. One, I don't think it can be said often enough the importance of the evidence-based part of it, right? There are so many programs in these spaces, making sure that they really are evidence-based so that we know that they work. The other thing I love about this slide is I can imagine so many foundations philanthropists who might say, I wouldn't know where to begin in this space. I don't want to get involved in terrorism or politics or that kind of thing. But there's a good chance there's something on this page that they would be comfortable with, or they might already be involved with,
Right.
and have the kinds of relationships. So, we already work with our local human services around referrals, and is there a way that we can use that expertise to do our part in this space? That's great.
I can't tell you how many times people have said, I want to do something in this space, but I'm afraid of de-radicalization. And so this slide helps set the landscape of there are lots of ways that you can be part of the solution and fun part of the solution in a way that is consistent with your risk tolerance.
Excellent. And for those foundations who do view themselves in this space and want to build coalitions, you could look at this list and say, who do I know who's involved in youth resilience? And maybe we can bring them into the coalition. So I've got my eye on the clock, so I want to move quickly. Anything else to add in the communication ecosystem? Rachel or Jenny? Rachel first, since that's your...
Sure. There's probably too much to say, and I don't want to use all of our time. My background is in the communications and narrative that leads towards this type of violence. I think there's a lot of funding and work on disinformation. I see that as fundamentally sort of part of the same problem as these harmful, dangerous narratives that follow patterns that we know globally. There is a lot of scope for work here on many angles, from doing work with narrative media to, like I said, there is a need for really large-scale efforts that actually tackle what we're seeing in terms of the rabbit holes that people are being pulled down online, and in terms of engaging platforms, not necessarily just for content moderation, but looking at some of the structures and algorithms that are set up to actually pull down these rabbit holes and looking at where the fixes are. So there's a ton of work to be done there. I think it intersects with all of the other bubbles on that diagram, and some level of communication awareness and engagement needs to be part of each of those other areas.
So, and if we could switch back to the other slide, Jenny, anything you want to jump in, either in the communication ecosystem space, or in particular, I think your experience in that center circle around field coordination, support, and research.
Sure. I mean, this, first of all, it's such a terrific panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for your presentations thus far. The one thing I would add on the communications is journalism and investing in local journalism. A lot of the journalists and media platforms that are coming together want to do the right thing with reporting, but sometimes the headline writers, the newsletter drafters, we have a changed information environment that's impacted by clicks and headlines, and that can highlight and increase calls to violence and extremism rather than reducing them, even if we have good reporting. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for investment around journalism and media education. I'm happy to talk a little bit about the field coordination. As Rachel said, folks on this panel are leading in this realm, but we need to set some direction and demonstrate the strategies and interventions that we've been talking about today are both concrete, evidence-based, and can have real impact. We are not without. And I think just cultivating and honing that leadership and investing in this generational change that we really have to set our eyes long-term if we're going to turn the ship around in terms of bringing the temperature down and reducing and intervening to move us away from the violent culture that's having real impact.
Great. And again, I just want to say the idea that, when it comes to what does the philanthropic sector do best, of course, there's funding, which is on the bottom, and that's a part of it. But this idea that one thing the foundation community is very good at is creating those sector backbone organizations, convening, being a table around which people convene, and that's not only is it important, but that's a particular role that often philanthropy plays that other sectors benefit from. So in terms of foundations, again, who may say, I don't know where to start, or even if this enormous menu of intervention ideas that have come up don't resonate, for some, the answer might be, well, we know how to bring people around a table and get them talking. Activities like this summit, which we're proud to support, and I know there are other kind of gatherings like this. And Jenny and I actually got to know each other because we both participate in a community of practice that's organized through the Democracy Funders Network, thanks in part to the Klarman Foundation, and I apologize if I'm missing another sponsor of that group, where a bunch of funders who are particularly concerned about political violence, the kind of violence that could lead to prevent people from participating in civic life, just bringing funders together has been enormously helpful. Imagine bringing together so many practitioners as well. So we're on the yellow. We're not in the red yet, but we're in the yellow. So I want to go around at least one more time, and this is just an opportunity. What advice do you have that, either something you haven't gotten out yet, or what advice do you have for a funder who, after hearing all of this panel, still might not be convinced that this is a space where they can make a difference? What advice do you have for them getting started? Brett?
Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't start with me. I think the reality is, yes, it's an emerging field, but we're learning a lot about what works. And so talk to other funders in this space. It is really helpful when you pool funding. And look for those evidence-informed practices to really ensure that you get the return on your investment.
Even though a lot of our funding does go directly to law enforcement, we do encourage a lot of partnerships with local stakeholders, especially community-based organizations. We know that they're on the front lines. I've heard some really great speakers at this summit talk about the importance of these organizations in terms of prevention, in terms of being able to do the direct outreach. And even while we encourage these partnerships, they don't always happen. And I think part of the problem is that these organizations lack a lot of funding. They have difficulty applying. They don't even know where to apply for funding, particularly federal funding. But I think philanthropy does a great job in terms of scoping the field, and there are so many really wonderful community-based and local organizations who lack the capacity to handle much funding. And so really thinking about capacity building, particularly with culturally specific organizations. We know, especially in the anti-hate space, it is really, really important for victims and survivors to be able to go to the local sort of culturally specific organization that understands their specific needs. There certainly aren't enough of those organizations out there. There are a lot of wonderful organizations doing great work that don't have enough funding. And we really need to seed, as someone earlier in the summit spoke about, to really seed prevention through thinking about local communities and thinking about how to support these locally based organizations.
Yeah, again, it's going to depend on the type of philanthropy and the appetite for risk and types of investment. I do really want to appreciate and emphasize what Hayne was just saying. We know this from international practice as well, that groups that are on the front lines of violence are often organizing and coming up with creative and important solutions, but don't get necessarily the funding or the seat at the table for their knowledge and expertise to really be appreciated. So if you are able to make that type of grant, I would add that to whatever starting portfolio, because I think that there's a lot to learn. Also, for someone new to the space, by engaging in really local groups. And I would also just really second what Brett just said. I think that these types of learning communities, pool funds, coordinating with other donors is really important. There are a lot of pathways into this space, and you can find one that is most relevant to a sector you already have knowledge in or a type of investment you already make. But knowing where it fits into a broader ecosystem and being able to learn with other funders matters. And we also know, and this might sound fluffy, but I promise it's not. It's very research-based. Relationships matter when it comes to preventing violence, when it comes to responding to political violence. People being able to act as part of a community and in relationships with others really matter. matters. So finding those relationships with other funders, with different organizations in the space, with government counterparts, and building those relationships and learning together is going to mean that when you feel confused or have a question, you're going to be able to access it. So I would just reiterate, I think it's an inescapable issue. And we know what happens if we do nothing about it. And I think it's on all of us to figure out where we have leverage, what role we can play, where our unique capabilities can fit in. It's essential for any other issue we want to solve.
Jenny?
Thank you. I align with everything that's been said, and we'll just bring back the perspective for the Trusted Elections Fund, which is our elections. And for those of us who are, which is all of us, watching what's happening in our democracy, it's in the headlines every day. This hate-fueled, identity-based political violence, it's showing up in our democracy, small d democracy. It is not partisan, but it feels partisan. And I just urge everyone not to disengage because it feels too partisan. Everything is politicized in America these days, but this is our democracy, and this is something that is impacting all of us. And when election officials and other government actors are threatened or intimidated from doing their jobs, this is a call to act. And for all of us to put our best foot forward to engage, to strengthen our democracy. And it's not just around election times, but the kind of relationship building and resiliency work that everyone on the panel has talked about in this last hour requires year-round long-term investments, because when you're in a crisis or when violence hits, and Josh, you talk about the impact in the community, you pick up the phone of someone you trust. You call on your friends and allies, and those relationships matter. And we can strengthen the relationship between government and philanthropy and local nonprofit organizations. But that's what it requires for all of us to work together to have impact. So engage.
I feel conflicted. That is the perfect place, I think, to wrap things up. I do want to acknowledge we got a couple of questions in, and I hope certainly the person who asked about moving from reactionary to proactive, I hope you heard particularly in that other slide. I hope you saw that. I want to name the question about what stakeholders or communities have not been included in current philanthropy efforts, and how can philanthropy engage the stakeholders moving forward. We probably didn't talk about that enough, about the importance of having broad coalitions. And not only do we need more philanthropy involved, we need wider sections of the community involved to create these kinds of broad coalitions. And it's something for philanthropy to be aware of. And I think an area where philanthropy can be helpful, bringing connections from diverse parts of the community and making sure that they're at the table and a part of these coalitions. Anyone want to add anything on that point?
I would just say I've been incredibly impressed by how the philanthropic community has mobilized around political violence. We have not yet seen a comparable level of effort for hate-fueled violence. So take those lessons learned from mobilizing around political violence and apply them to other forms of targeted violence like school-based violence and hate-fueled violence, because there's a need across all of these forms of violence. And frankly, the risk factors are also quite comparable. So there's a lot we can learn from one another.
So I would again reemphasize impacted communities being central to any initiative, and really being able to help sustain and scale those types of initiatives, as well as the lessons and the knowledge that comes from them. And I would also say that sometimes with our programming, we think about building capacity where there are groups that are committed or interested, and building commitment where people think this isn't really my issue or it's too scary to get involved for whatever reasons. And that building commitment is harder. When you're building capacity, you can kind of guarantee what's going to happen. This group will have capacity and then they'll engage. When you're building commitment, you're up against a whole lot of incentives against people in engaging and acting. So if you have a little bit of a higher risk tolerance and you're interested in expanding these coalitions, you can think about initiatives that are actually seeking to reach and engage audiences that matter but are not yet engaged and are actually seeking to build their commitment and engagement and bring them sort of into this work.
Excellent. Well, we're over time. I want to thank this amazing panel and thank all of you in person and on the live stream. I think we covered a lot of ground around the importance of setting outcomes and defining what it is you're trying to accomplish. We've seen that there are no shortage of evidence-based solutions that philanthropy can get involved in to help support and lift up that are all a piece of the larger puzzle. We talked about the enormous need for philanthropy to not just invest, but also help organize the sector and organize themselves as a sector. And I think that leads to our canned, we had already planned this ahead of time, in terms of a specific recommendation where this panel was originally titled a funder's manual for the prevention space. This idea that there'd be a static thing that here you want to fund in the space, here's a playbook, that really what's needed is more of a community of practice, a space where funders can come together, learn from each other, learn about each other, and because the dialogue is ongoing. So with that, thank you very much. And I think it's time to go across the hall for a closing plenary. No, we have one more round of panels. One more round of panels. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jenny.